Okay, we're good. We're going to start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. And thank you very much for braving the weather outside. It will well be worth it, I assure you. First of all, my name is Arlene Huggins. I am the newly elected president of the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers. The Law Society of Upper Canada and the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers are pleased to present today's Black History Month event featuring our panel discussion on advocacy beyond the courtroom. And following the panel discussion, immediately following, will be a reception in Convocation Hall, which is right upstairs. You don't have to go outside at all, where we will have entertainment and refreshments. This event is part of the Law Society's Public Education Equality Series program. The Law Society delivers a series of public education events throughout the year to promote awareness, education, and discussion on the challenge and opportunities for equality-seeking communities in law and the legal profession. It involves various legal organizations representing equality-seeking communities, such as the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers. CABLE is once again proud to partner with the Law Society of Upper Canada in the development of today's program and event to honor Black History Month. Today's program brings together an impressive group of speakers, which you will hear from in a moment, who will present their perspectives and reflections on advocacy beyond the courtroom. Please note that this event is being recorded so that it can be broadcasted later on the internet. Therefore, if time permits, we will have some questions from the floor, and we'll invite you to step up to a microphone, which will be in place at that time, to the side, so that your questions can be heard by all and recorded. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge, first of all, the wonderful assistance and cooperation of the Law Society of Upper Canada, who has partnered with us on a number of other initiatives, and we really appreciate the work of the Law Society. And I want to acknowledge as well some guests in the audience. Minister Margaret Best, as you all know, who is the Ontario Minister of Consumer Services, and also the Treasurer of the Law Society. We are so pleased to have in attendance tonight Mr. Thomas Conway, and I invite Mr. Conway to step forward and give remarks on behalf of the Law Society. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene. Minister Best, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here and great to welcome you all to the Law Society's annual Black History Month event. C'est un plaisir d'être ici cet après-midi et de vous accueillir à notre activité annuelle pour le mois de l'histoire des Noirs. I'd like to thank the organizers for allowing me to speak at the beginning of the event. The weather is just one of the vagaries of an out-of-town treasurer that I have to overcome. If I stayed until the reception and brought greetings on behalf of the Law Society, I'm told I wouldn't be able to get back to Ottawa until late tomorrow, so it looks like it's going to be quite a storm. So I appreciate your indulgence, and because this is Black History Month, this is a must-attend event for the Treasurer, and I'm pleased that you've permitted me to speak out of turn so as not to break that tradition. Today's celebrations have been organized in partnership with the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers, or CABLE. Each year, the Law Society celebrates Black History Month with CABLE, which is now in its 17th year as an association. And CABLE brings together black law professionals to foster achievement and cultivate excellence among its membership. CABLE has also become an indispensable support for many black students and recently called lawyers seeking to establish those all-important professional connections and social networks to succeed in their legal careers. The Law Society is greatly appreciative of its partnership with CABLE over the years. From the very beginning of its mandate, CABLE and its members have been involved in various capacities to promote equity and diversity within the legal profession. The Law Society and CABLE have an excellent collaborative working relationship, and we look forward to continuing our work together to achieve our common goals. Today, we're gathered to celebrate Black History Month. This year's celebrations throughout the United States and Canada mark the milestone anniversaries of two significant historical moments, which I think is important to highlight on this special occasion. 2013 marks the 150th year of President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, in the midst of the bloodiest Civil War in history, and which ultimately led to the end of slavery in the United States. 2013 also marks the 50th anniversary of the historic March on Washington in 1963, which brought the civil rights movement to unprecedented heights. And as many will recall, or at least some of you will recall, Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech was delivered at the March on Washington, a speech that rightly holds its place to this day as one of the great masterpieces of oration. 2013 will also be written in the history books, I suspect, as the year of the inauguration of President Obama's second-term presidency. Itself an historic achievement, and it's of course fitting that President Obama's second inauguration occurred on Martin Luther King Day. Now, one thing that we haven't achieved yet is we don't have a black treasurer. We've never had a black treasurer, so Arlene, I see your future unfolding before you. Andrew, maybe you might want to consider it. Our theme for Black History Month this year is focused on community advocacy. Today's panel discussion will explore different types of community advocacy that promote social justice and equal opportunities for Black communities in Canada. We have assembled a distinguished group of speakers with different experience and different perspectives. They will reflect on the history, the struggles, the achievements, and the contribution of Black Canadians to the fabric of our country. So I wish to thank our panel of speakers, who will all be formally introduced in a few moments, for participating in today's discussion. We are pleased that you could join us at the Law Society to celebrate Black History Month. As we honor community advocacy on this special occasion, I want to recognize the recent loss of two venerable champions of the Black community and two very distinguished members of the legal community, Charles Roach and the Honorable Lincoln Alexander, who regretfully passed away last year. Both were trailblazers in their own ways. In addition to succeeding in their careers, they made significant contributions to their communities and were known for their community activism and the never-ending fight for social justice and equality. So as we celebrate Black History Month, we also recognize and celebrate the lives and contributions of individuals like Charles Roach and Lincoln Alexander. So I would like to extend my best wishes to the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers on its 17th year. The Law Society is very proud to be a partner again with CABLE in celebrating Black History Month. I wish to thank CABLE for organizing today's event with the Law Society's Equity Initiatives Department. We are grateful for your partnership and contributions in helping to promote equity, to promote diversity, and to promote access to justice in the legal profession. Je désire remercier l'Association des avocats noirs du Canada d'avoir organisé cet événement avec le service d'équité du Bureau. Nous sommes heureux de votre partenariat et de vos contributions à l'équité, à la diversité et à l'accès à la justice dans la profession juridique. Merci à tous et à toutes d'assister aux célébrations du mois de l'histoire des Noirs. I'm very sorry that I can't stay for the rest of the program, but I thank you all for joining us here today and wish you a very memorable event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tom. I'd like to now introduce our moderator for this evening's forum, Kike Roach, who will guide us through today's discussion. Kike is a civil rights lawyer and public speaker. She studied law at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and at the Université Jean Moulin, Lyon, in France. Her practice focuses largely on civil actions against the state for negligence, breach of constitutional rights, and malicious prosecution, as well as on defamation and human rights. She is passionate about reforming policing and the rights of those in detention and in prison. She sought to bring about systemic changes through representing plaintiffs, families, and communities before the courts at numerous coroners' inquests and by working with grassroots organizations such as the Black Action Defense Committee. Kike is the co-author of the book Politically Speaking, which is required reading in several gender studies and political science courses at university and colleges. She has addressed diverse audiences across Canada and in the United States, and has led anti-racism workshops for the United Steelworkers of America, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, and the Canadian Auto Workers Union. In addition to her numerous media appearances on a variety of social justice issues, Kike was also a regular legal commentary on the CTV news channels, and many of you may have seen her there. As many of you know, Kike is one of the children of Charles Roach, who, as we've heard, passed away last year in October. Charles was a well-known and respected lawyer, community leader, activist, author, poet, musician, in essence, in my view, a Renaissance man. I've known Kike for a number of years, and she carries on her father's tradition of advocating for systemic change through all manners of advocacy. We are fortunate and very pleased to have Kike with us today, and I give the floor to you, Kike. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arlene. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Thank you very much to the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers, to the Law Society for hosting us here today, and to everybody who helped put together this event. And thank you very much to all of you for coming out on this balmy February day. Advocacy. What do we mean by that? At a very basic level, you could say advocacy is simply about speaking out for one's rights, speaking out to assert one's rights and to create conditions in which we can flourish, grow, and carry on our lives to the fullest of their potential. On a basic level, you can say it's about speaking about rights. And I remember one time my father was being interviewed on the radio. And the interviewer said to him, well, you know, Mr. Roach, you keep talking about your rights, you know, the rights all the time. I want to ask you a question. What about your responsibilities? To which he answered, my responsibility is to speak out for my rights and to speak out for the rights of others. As lawyers, we might think of advocacy as, you know, donning a court robe and going in and representing our clients with our legal training. But when I think about my dad, I actually think about the many different ways in which he advocated. Professionally, of course, but to him, advocacy could have meant, you know, donning a court robe, or it could have just as easily meant picking up a guitar, you know, putting together some calypso about demanding an end to unfair immigration practices. It could have just as easily meant gathering a group of people to plot and strategize about how we were going to make manifest our disagreement with the apartheid regime and Canada's collusion with the apartheid state when South Africa was engaged in that. When I think of him, he's really somebody who brings to mind a notion of there very much being a need for a diversity of tactics when it comes to advocacy. And that's what our focus is today. We as a people in the African diaspora who have had our languages, our cultures, our religions, our forms of self-organization stripped away from us, have very much been thrown into situations where in order to really reclaim our full dignity, we have had to be advocates, whether legally trained or not, in so many different venues, whether in education, in many professions, in the arts and entertainment. And we know that it's protest that has helped us to carry forward many of those and vindicate many of our rights. But we know that sometimes the advocacy is done on other levels, in other fields, in other venues. And so we're blessed to have with us today a group of people who have a great deal of insight and knowledge about how we make our voices, our stories, and our history heard, remembered, and continue to grow and flourish. So, I mean, while we sit here today and in honor of Black History Month, we remember that, you know, we know a lot about advocacy, and there's a long history of advocacy going back to Marianne Shadd Carey publishing the Provincial Freeman right there at 5 King Street, advocating for the end of slavery, up to today with letter writing campaigns to establish Flow 93.5 radio station to make our voices heard, that we've used so many different channels, tools, and tactics to advance ourselves and to enrich all of the places where we've found ourselves in the diaspora. So helping to reflect on all of these issues and questions to us today and ask the broad question, what does advocacy mean to you? And how does it make itself manifest in your life? We have with us a panel, and I'm going to actually have to be a little bit, I feel a little bit anxious about this, but I'm going to have to engage in some inequity myself right now, because although Arlene read my whole bio out, I'm not going to be reading the panel members' bios out in the interest of time. However, I do encourage you all to pick up the flyer that's available and to read their full bios, because they're very inspiring. But in the interest of time, and so that we can engage in discussion with all of you, I will just give an abbreviated version of our distinguished panel members. With us and right to my left is Sud Sutherland, who many of you may already know as a freelance writer and director, multiple award-winning, the creator of such works as Love, Sex, and Eating the Bones, the dramatic miniseries Guns, a writer for various television shows such as The Kink in My Hair, and a director also of many TV shows such as Degrassi and The Next Generation, and on and on and on, as well as numerous groundbreaking documentaries with the NFB. And with him, completing the dynamic duo, is Jennifer Holness, who is a writer and producer who also is a multi-award-winning professional in the media. She's co-created a 13-part comedy series called She's the Mayor, which airs on Vision TV. And she's also been instrumental in bringing forward other documentary films such as Dolores on the art of modeling and On Black Stage Women for Bravo, and was behind the groundbreaking NFB documentary Speakers for the Dead, and has brought to us, along with Suds, a new work called Home Again, which we will be talking about tonight. Beside her is Belinda Long. Belinda is currently the principal of Corvette Elementary School, and is someone who has a long history with the Toronto District School Board. She's been involved as a vice principal with the Nelson Mandela Park Public School, and she's worked extensively in numerous public schools in the Jane Finch and Regent Park areas. She's also somebody who's been seconded by the Department of Equity and Women's Services at the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario to help develop programs and curriculums and resources that focus on social justice issues. And she's got quite a bit of homework herself, I understand, because she's pursuing a PhD in literacy and teacher education. And beside her is Professor Alyssa Trotz, who knows well a lot of that history that I was referencing, and has, through her writings and teaching at the U of T, where she teaches in the Women and Genders Studies Institute, and where she's also the director of the Caribbean Studies program, has helped to really deepen and document our knowledge and understanding of how we as African people, as Caribbean people, have negotiated the different places where we've found ourselves, and how we've occupied and enriched those spaces through our feminist activism, through our struggles against social inequalities. And joining us, we're very pleased to have Dr. Gurvan Firan, who is the current dean of the Raymond Chang School of Continuing Education. And I understand that you're to be congratulated, as you've been recently named as the vice provost and the vice president, sorry, and academic and provost at Brandon University, a post that he'll be taking up later on this year. Dr. Firan is somebody who understands really the power of working with institutions, whether it's in academia, government, or community service. He's been a professor at York University, at Ryerson, pretty much every university in Toronto, basically, and has worked with the Ontario government in the ministries of education, agriculture, and finance, and has also brought his expertise to bear as the former president of the board of directors for Tropicana Community Services Organization. There's so much more to say about all of these talented individuals, but again, I encourage you to look at their bios. And I want to open up with a more general question first to the panel, which is to just ask that basic question that we were raising earlier. What does advocacy mean to you, particularly as you reflect on the work that within your own particular fields? And if you could tell us a little bit more about what approach you take to advocacy, and tell us a little bit more in the context of that, of how you have come to do what it is that you're doing today. And I want to start with you, please.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Just as I start in, just thank you very much for having me on the panel, and it's a bit of a pleasure to maybe share ideas with all of you, and for it to be an exchange much more than a lecture or just a one-way dialogue. But advocacy to me means maybe three things. The first one is giving voice to those individuals who may not be in a position of power, or in a position to be able to express their needs or their voice, so giving voice in that regard. So that may mean helping them be advocates for themselves or advocating on behalf of. The second case for me of advocacy is where institutions in one degree or another are implicitly failing. So whether it is because of the democratic institutional frameworks do not give voice to the issues at hand. So an example on that would be South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement. So that's advocacy, because the democratic institutions does not give voice to the issues in that regard. Or it may be a scenario where the institutions are actually missing that interest group in that regard. And then lastly, it is the ability to be able to bring to bear critical analysis and reflection on what we currently do in terms of fairness and some core principles. So that would be my three cases as quick ones. What are some of the things that I've done? I think in terms of education, it's actually ensuring that we have engaged students, that they have a sense that this is a society for which they're active participants, and in that regard they are equal in building and contributing to the betterment of society, as opposed to be passively engaged in society. In terms of my volunteer work, I think that really lends more to the first principle of giving voice to individuals who may not have that voice. But then in terms of the second construct, of where institutions are implicitly failing. It's contributing to the building of institutions that address broader needs rather than narrow ones would be my three examples relative to the three principles as well.
Okay, well, you've spoken generally. I'm wondering if you might give us a little bit more of a flavor of how you've come to be in all of these different, you've been in government, you've been in academia, you've been at the head of Tropicana. Can you give us a flavor of how have you come to that and what you're doing today?
Well, I guess like all of us, history, we're path dependent. So Jamaican parents, born in England, grew up here. And what that means is that I've been outside of society almost everywhere I've lived. So I've been outside of society when I was born in England. My parents moved to Jamaica. I was outside of society. When I came here, I was outside of society. So by age 9, I actually thought I'm outside of society. So in that regard, I grew up with a context of really being analytical about our institutions and how they work and whether my voice, for one, or anybody else's voice was being heard. The other part of it, though, is I grew up in Toronto at a time when relationships, for example, between the black community and the police had a far way to go. So the problematic gap between the desired and the existing situation was pretty broad, and people were looking at different strategies. And there were choices. There were choices between whether you protest or whether you pick other avenues. And I actually looked at the full spectrum. That protest was one, so I view the ideas or the actions of, at a broad global sense of, say, Martin Luther King as having value. I also viewed that the ideas of Malcolm X had value. So in my own view, I viewed, even on addressing the relationship with the police, as one could protest outside the police station, or you could become a constitutional lawyer. And in education, I recall in grade 12 surveying the education system for in relation to how West Indians were being treated in the education system, whether it was working or not. And I went around to a number of high schools, and a theater arts teacher, I was actually up on the stage asking her this question and raising all kinds of issues, expressing problems and the likes. And she got totally frustrated at me and said, well, why don't you become a teacher and you fix it? And I absolutely never forgot that.
So you took up the challenge.
I took up the challenge.
Very good, very good. And someone else who's spent almost 20 years now in the education system is Belinda. Belinda, can you answer that question? What does advocacy mean to you on a day-to-day basis, and how has it informed some of the work that you have done and what you're doing today?
Okay, well, I guess for me, and you'll have to forgive me, I have a bit of a cold, so I'll try to speak up. I see myself as advocating for everyone within the building, so parents, students, teachers, of course, and community agencies that are sometimes working with us as partners. And I think a big challenge, especially for children of African descent in the education system, is that parents are not always adept at navigating the complexities of the education system. They don't know that they have a right to come in and request a meeting with a teacher or the principal or the vice principal, and their voice isn't really heard in the classrooms. And that makes a big difference in terms of the kinds of experiences and success that their children may or may not have. So I see my role as someone who has to kind of get outside of the office. So traditionally, principals and vice principals are behind closed doors and teachers are kind of locked in their classrooms. But I've always been more engaged in the hallways, coaching teams, supervising girls groups, and then getting outside and talking to parents. So as a principal, I can be outside in the yard greeting parents, telling them about our next parent council meeting. Those kinds of things make a difference just in terms of building relationships with people. And I think I've built a lot of my career around building positive relationships with parents and letting them know that they do have a voice, that they should be at the council meetings, that they should be complaining if they're not happy with what's happening in the classroom, and that it doesn't mean that their child's going to feel some sort of reprisal from the teacher, but in fact, it'll probably make the teacher have a more heightened awareness that somebody's watching and thinking about what they're doing with their children. And so getting parents to see that they have a very pivotal role in whether or not how their child's going to experience the education system and whether or not they're going to sort of be successful in terms of how one might define success in academics. So that's one way in which I see myself as an advocate, because I can build those relationships and share information. There's
Where does that passion come from, Belinda? What's gone on? Can you tell us a little bit more about your background?
Sure.
Why are you motivated to do this?
Well, I actually grew up outside of Toronto in St. Catharines. And I think my sister and myself were the only black children in the school at the time. My father's Guyanese, my mother's from Trinidad, and he was a ship captain, so we ended up in the Niagara region because it was close to the canal. So my father and mother were both very vocal about speaking up for us and telling us, from grade 2 and 3 about making sure that I questioned or challenged the teachers, or did you not get picked because you're black, you better find out. And you sort of like, okay, Dad, I'm in grade 3, really? I'm not sure that's the reason. But he starts early. He started early, and I think it sort of planted that seed of, just because there might be nobody else in this room that looks like me, it doesn't mean I don't belong here, and it doesn't mean I shouldn't have a voice. And so that sort of confidence was instilled in me at a very young age. And I remember actually in grade 4, I had a teacher who, if you got the highest mark on something, you got to be the teacher for the day. And I got the highest mark, and I got to be the teacher for the day. And I sort of loved that opportunity to sort of be, the one sort of facilitating what was going to happen. And, I do like telling people what to do sometimes. So I guess that's maybe where the passion was lit at the beginning, to get involved in education. And I wanted to see more people at the front of the room who looked like me. And, I'm still a student. I'm doing my PhD, and I've, in fact, so I've been a student for, a very long time, and I've never had a black teacher or professor in my experience.
Till today, up to today.
Up until today.
Wow.
So that's where some of the motivation comes from for me.
Wow.
Alyssa, could you tell us a little bit more about where your interest and passion comes from? You write about issues of social inequality. You study. You're currently researching Caribbean feminism, feminist activism. Can you tell us, what does advocacy mean to you, and how did you come to do what you're doing today?
Thank you, and thanks for having me here. I think the first thing I want to say is, just before the panel started, a friend of mine who's here this evening was sharing with me her experience of being a parent of a child in high school who was experiencing quite a lot of racism. And I found out today that this high school didn't take my 13-year-old, and I'm really relieved now. But I just wanted to begin by saying that the work that you're doing, Belinda, is so absolutely important and so foundational. I'm a mom of an 11 and 13-year-old, and I guess part of my motivation comes from the fact that I grew up in a small place. I'm from Guyana. I went to school there. I wanted to be a lawyer, so I'm a teacher by accident. I've only ever known school. I've studied and then ended up teaching. I've not had any sort of career or life outside of the academy. But I grew up in this place where, I always grew up with a place on a map in relation to a world. And so I came to Canada as an 18-year-old with a certain global and geopolitical critical literacy that I one, didn't find here, and two, I also grew up in a place where there are class and racial problems, but I never had to contend with myself as a minority in the way that I see my kids having to struggle with who they are. And so I guess having that insider-outsider relationship, and a lot of my activism today continues to be in the Caribbean, sort of, I think, really motivates me to try to think about the ways in which we can talk about it in a Canadian context. I think advocacy, the way we've been talking about it, is both diagnostic and transformative. But for me, there's a key quality to it that always has to be part of the picture, and that's accountability. And I want to just share two stories with you from the University of Toronto, where I teach. So we have begun in the Caribbean Studies program doing a lot of really important community events. It has become a space where the Caribbean community in particular knows that they can come for events. And at an event last year, one of my students came. She's an older woman who went back to school. And she came with her mother, who lived and worked in Canada for a long time and then went back to Jamaica. And they came into the event. This was at New College, where I'm located, which is an amazing college for the kinds of programs that it has. She came into the room and she was in tears. And I said, what happened? She said, I brought my mom in here. And she said, this is where I worked for many years as a cleaner. So that's story number one. And story number two is about a about a few months ago. It was early on a Saturday morning. I was coming into my office, and there were these two young black men. They couldn't be more than 15, 16. teenagers looking really uncomfortable, asking for directions from people on campus, and clearly people were beginning to look quite hostile in relation to them. I stopped to ask them. Turns out they had been invited to some sort of diversity thingamajig at the Faculty of Physical Education and Health. They didn't know how to get there. And then when I showed them how to get there, they asked, if they had permission to get into the building. I want to say that because I want to recognize that the first lesson of advocacy has to be accountability. There's a Guyanese historian who was assassinated at 39, who is my mentor, Walter Rodney. And I always say to my students, he has taught us that you can believe that you're at university. I can believe I'm at the University of Toronto. I'm black and I'm bright, and yet Belinda's never met a black educator, so something is failing. I can believe that I'm there because I'm better than everyone else. We have a meritocracy in this country that tries to tell us that we are there because we deserve to be there. Or we can believe that we're there because there's hundreds and thousands, you talked about your father and all of these other people, whose struggles made it possible for us to be there. The young woman whose mom was a cleaner in that building, all of those people we don't see, that entire infrastructure that puts us there. And if we recognize that, then it seems to me accountability takes on an entirely new meaning, because it has to be about inculcating habits of humility in relation to communities you're working with. And it has to be absolutely about trying to change the institutions we work with. So for me, the University of Toronto is a site of activism. How do we make institutions of higher learning less inhospitable to young black people in this country? How do we try to engage questions of curricular reform? It shouldn't be just that you have to have a black teacher. It should be that all teachers understand the importance of intellectual diversity. How do we open up those questions? And to me, I think that is key, but it can't happen unless we understand and inculcate habits of humility and recognize that accountability is really at the bottom of whatever it is advocacy is supposed to be.
Thank you very much. It was interesting that you were talking about being from Guyana and then now seeing your own kids here and having to negotiate and living a very different reality than the one that you grew up with, and having to contend with Canadian society. And these are some of the themes that have been picked up in a new work that a new film brought to us by Jennifer Holness and Sud Sutherland, Home Again. And I believe that you've brought us a clip a trailer.
Yeah, we brought a trailer to take a look at. So why don't we roll it?
And so before I ask you the question of how did you come to do what you're doing, let's see some of what you've done. If we could have that trailer shown now.
Okay.
This is Home Again.
Turn down the lights.
Yeah, can we dim the lights? It's always better to see stuff with dimmed lights. Worked.
I'm only here for a minute. Enjoy your minute.
I really need this job. You're a deportee, aren't you? They can't hire a criminal.
I'm looking for Samuel St. Clair.
I've been looking for my son everywhere.
You got a beautiful smile.
You love me, right?
There are other ways to pay for things. Make an example out of done. You don't know.
I'm in trouble. Why you do this for?
There's only one law here in Greenwich Farm.
Fight or be killed. The trailer that you just saw was from Home Again. It's a feature film that we shot in Trinidad, Jamaica, and also Canada. It had its world premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival in September, and it's coming to a theater near you on March 22nd. My name is Sud Sutherland. I'm a writer and director. I work in partnership with Jennifer Holness, this beautiful sister beside me, who is also a writer and producer. Full disclosure, as we are in a room full of lawyers, she is also my wife, the mother of our 3 daughters.
2 of them have just
2
arrived.
of them who have just arrived and will be very quiet.
It's a warning.
The other one is at gymnastics practice. Our film production is called Hungry Eyes. Film and television. We named the company Hungry Eyes because when we were growing up, there was a paucity of images of people of color in general and black people specifically. When there were images of us, we found them embarrassing. You know, I became a filmmaker to address those images, create complex characters and stories that are more reflective of the lives that we all lead. Our feature film, Home Again, debuting March 22nd. Did I say that before? Clear with that. Looks at the issue of people born abroad, in this case, Jamaica, raised in the U.S., U.K., and Canada, the Jamaican diaspora. But they're moved there in childhood, and they were deported back home in their 20s. We started down this road when we discovered one of Jen's childhood friends had been deported and later killed in Jamaica, just as he was turning his life around. We went down to Jamaica in 2005. Interviewed over 40 deportees, and the script is based on their life experiences. This has been a 6-year struggle to get this film made and bring this story to the world. Every year, approximately 3,000 Jamaicans are deported back home from the U.S., U.K., and Canada without any resettlement programs of any kind. Jamaica is a poor country with limited infrastructure, and we're calling on governments like Canada and the U.S. to begin to address this in the form of resettlement programs. The UK has just taken the lead implementing a program recently for Jamaican deportees, and we're calling on the Canadian government to do the same. We are glad to be here today at this event, but it's a very weird bit of timing. Just yesterday, Bill C-43, the Faster Removal of Foreign Criminals Act, has just become law. The score was 149 to 130. And this was without any participation from the Liberals and the NDP. It was a clear majority, and that's what happened. This is a number of offensive things about this bill, which overly politicizes the Department of Immigration. But one of the worst is that if an individual is sentenced to a term in excess of 6 months or greater, they're automatically deported with no chance of appeal. I don't have to tell an audience of a room full of lawyers that 6 months can be for very, very minor crimes. But what's going to happen now is, and this is our fear, is that this law will punish a lot of young people making teenage mistakes. And this can actually, in effect, become a death sentence. And this is what we're trying to do, trying to spread the word about this. We're trying to, again, through petitions, the advocacy of doing the film, spreading the word out, to try to make people aware of this, because there's a lot of people who are completely asleep to this fact. Yes. This is going to create an untold amount of misery for people all over the world. And we're not just talking about Jamaica or the Caribbean. We're talking about all over the world. The kids on the streets of Saigon who are Canadian, raised here, came over as children, don't even know a lick of Chinese or Vietnamese, and they're on the streets begging. So this is the kind of work that we do. A lot of our work, be it either documentary or feature filmmaking, dramatic filmmaking, is around issues specific to our community, but also influences greater. But that's how we, again, we came to this from, I guess, the point of view of we want to make a change, and we want to say it artistically.
I was going to ask you, Jennifer, actually.
Yeah.
I don't think you came originally from a film background, right?
That's
How
right.
did you come into this medium
Yeah.
and he talked a little bit about it
Yeah.
being 6 years in the making. What were some of those stories behind that?
Okay, so just give a bit of context. So when I went to university, I started in politics. I have a specialized honors in policy analysis. And then I actually was at one point going to go to law school, and then I didn't go to law school. I met Suds, and
It's not my fault.
it is his fault. And film, it was a really exciting time. It was like Spike Lee, it was Cosby Show. There were suddenly images of black people on television and in cinemas, and those images were something that I recognized. I understood them. They weren't these sort of foreign. Is that a black person really? Why are they doing that? So we sort of jumped in together and started making films very early on. Now, from the very beginning, for me, filmmaking has always been about bringing to a world audience who we really are as people, bringing agency to black individuals, diasporic black individuals, also people of color, because whatever that looks like, whatever that shape is, because I do feel going to the cinemas my whole life, looking at magazines, I've often felt outside of things. And you talk about growing up here. I was born in Jamaica, and I came here when I was 5 years old, and that transition was traumatic. And then as I grow up, though, you have a sense that you don't actually belong. So filmmaking from the very beginning has always meant bringing forth these voices. So one of the first projects that we actually jumped on, and you mentioned it, was Speakers for the Dead. And Speakers for the Dead, and this is for me what advocacy really means and why this work has always been around that. Speakers for the Dead was a documentary that looked at black history in Canada, because going through the school system, my entire education was in Canadian school system, I actually saw almost nothing about African Canadians. I didn't even know there were African Canadians. I remember one day somebody said, oh, that person has been here for like a couple of hundred years, or their family background. I was like, what are you talking about? There are no black people here. They just arrived, in the 60s and, maybe the 50s, and also whatever images that I did see around Africans were sort of very remote. Very far, it was Africa. And then there was also Americans. So Speakers for the Dead was a film that really sought to, when we discovered they were African American Canadians, to actually find them and find their stories. So this was about a community in a place called Priceville, which was an entirely white town, where the people who lived there didn't even know that Priceville was named after Colonel Price, who was a black loyalist soldier who had brought a bunch of black folks from America and loyalist soldiers and slaves, and formed a town and built a school and all this, and just created a community. And so basically 150 years later, there was no evidence of this community being a black community. There was no evidence that Colonel Price was a black man. And so we actually told that story of Priceville and what actually happened to the black people. So from that community that actually got pushed out of Priceville eventually. So our work leading to now Home Again, sort of from Guns, even Love, Sex, and the Bones, all of our work has been, there's always been something that we wanted to communicate about our experiences. Home Again came about, as Suds pointed out, because of a friend of mine that I had gone to school with, that I actually didn't know very well, but it was a young man who had followed a different path. But it was very strange to me, this notion that, like a guy who was just as Canadian as I felt I was just gone and just didn't belong somehow. And so when we went down to Jamaica and we saw the conditions that people who just didn't know how to cope in that environment because they just weren't raised in that environment, to be left without any sort of a net, without any kind of support. I mean, these were young people. We met a young man who had been shot, burnt, stabbed, chopped, lit on fire. Just one guy alone, just one story. So we just felt very strongly that we had to get this story told. And I have to tell you, the road to getting this story told was incredibly challenging, because people just don't give you money to make a story with an entire black cast. I should tell you that right now.
But Jennifer, before you go into that, something that I'm picking up from you and also every one of the panel members, a theme that I'm kind of hearing is this sense of we've had to really, stake our claim and create a sense of place for ourselves. Each one of you talked about always feeling like you're on the outside. You talked about never seeing yourself represented while you're going through and experiencing all of these different teachers. You spoke about your children and reflecting on the differences in their growing up. And you're talking about we get here and we try to stake out a life, and then we're uprooted and sent back to a place that's supposed to be our home, but that we don't even know. So each of us has found some sort of way to deal with those realities and yet take a tool, whether it's film, whether it's writing, whether it's educating, whether it's sitting at the table and advising people in government, and we've taken the tool to try to reclaim some of that space. But we must have had to have like models or ways in, and that leads me to the question that I wanted to throw up into the whole panel, which is, in this time when we continue to face challenges but achieve successes, how do we, create conditions in which people feel that they can really be themselves advocates in dynamic ways? How do we involve people in the community, or how can we support people who are already doing that in the community, and what are the ways in? Could you speak to that?
Sure. I'd just like to start off with a premise that you start off with, and to give a context. For me, this goes back to history class, about grade 7, and listening to the constitutional dialogue on the formation of Canada and talking about the English and the French. Okay, and so in that dialogue, I kind of sat around the room and said, well, that's interesting. I was born in England, so are you talking about me? And then said, oh, no, you're talking about the English. And I said, well, how many people here were born in England? Right? And all of a sudden I realized that
you were the only British person.
That's right. So in a sense, it is a statement of being on the outside, but it's also the recognition, particularly for individuals who were born here, who were not born somewhere else, wherever defining here is to recognize that the institutions belong as much to you as anybody else. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, there is I'm not quite sure who I define as being on the outside or the inside. Mm-hmm. Back to black communities in Ontario, Buxton, and so forth, it's not clear who is on the inside or outside. So,
speaking personally, like, did you have some role models? Did you join organizations? How did you find yourselves to be in the places that you've been?
Okay, role models. I would say there are lots of role models at one level.
Were they accessible to you personally?
Well, I would, anywhere from my parents to people in the community. In Toronto has always had such a really activist community in any case. Then internationally, they've always been role models. But interestingly enough, back to the statement that was made about black teachers and so forth, and growing up here, same kind of experience. But I actually have always had a slight difference in terms of my construct of role models, in the sense that I have never necessarily felt that I needed a role model mm-hmm. in the sense of someone directly close to me, mm-hmm. as much as being able to look towards people globally who've done great things and said, let me look at the values that they've actually lived up to. What did they actually do? Mm-hmm. So I would find a Malcolm X, a Martin Luther King, a Garvey, as much as a role model for me, as much as somebody who was tangibly right here in Toronto for me.
I think you've raised an important point earlier when you said that it starts with having a notion that this is my institution. I do belong here, and I'm meant to be here to contribute and to start from there. But so many kids don't feel that way, Belinda. Can you add to the conversation?
Well, as I was listening to him speak, and I was thinking it's hard if you don't have that personal confidence to sort of be like, well, I know I can do this, and just because no one else here has done what I want to do, I can get it. And it is hard to have that personal fortitude, and that might depend on who your parents are and how they've sort of supported you. So I think something that I've had to learn to do myself, because when I came to Toronto, I didn't know anyone, I didn't have any networks, I didn't have somebody that I could call up and say, how do I get a job, or how do I get into the school board? I had to really figure a lot of things out for myself, but I tried to join different organizations. I tried to volunteer. I just looked up different sort of organizations where, like, there was the African Canadian Student Association at U of T at the time, where, I became friends with someone who's in the audience now. We've now been friends for 20 years, and linking up with people who had other experiences and using that as an opportunity to learn more about other opportunities that were out there. And so just being really hungry to get involved in many different ways in the community so that I could figure out how I might open some doors that would otherwise not be open to me. But it is difficult. There's no sort of recipe that anyone can figure out. And you also have to be willing to build relationships with people who don't look like you, because certainly there was nobody in the positions of power who were of African descent to sort of open some of those doors for me. So I had to build relationships with people outside of the community and be willing to also work and trust people outside of the community who were open and didn't sort of have that deficit mentality that because you were a minority you couldn't be successful. So it's not just about working with your own community, it's about building relationships outside of the community, because there are people who are in positions of power who are willing to help you, who will open the door a little bit, or open the window at least, and give you an opportunity to say, oh, hey, this event is going on, you should come. And even events like this, where it's an opportunity for you to network with people from different professions who may also say, oh, you're interested, my son's interested in that program, and I know someone who has expertise in that area, maybe I can link you up and you can talk to them. And having access to information which you otherwise wouldn't have helps people move forward a little bit at a time.
You talked about the importance of organizing and networking. And I'm thinking historically of organizations like the Canadian Alliance of Black Educators, of the organization of parents of black children that were formed, I think, in the early 1980s. Do you see those organizations still continuing to reach out to people and to help to encourage and continue the struggles around so many issues that have come up for our community and within the school system?
Personally, I would have to actually say no, only because, for example, when I was a beginning teacher, I did reach out to the Canadian Association of Black Educators, but I never heard back from anybody. So, they may have supported other people along the way, but I certainly didn't have that experience. So I can't speak to that piece of it. And the parent organization I haven't been actively involved in either. But I would say that there are many opportunities today in 2013 that didn't exist 20 years ago when I first got into education, for young people and for parents to join organizations, to go to information events that are free, and to get out there and learn more about, oh, this is how I might apply to this school or this program, or this is the process, which actually starts in grade 9, not in grade 12, when you're thinking about applying to a program X or Y. And so I think there's a lot more access to information where you don't have to rely as much on personal relationships, because you can use the internet, you can do your research, but you still have to be willing to get up and look for it. It's not just going to come to you.
And I also think that, the organizations, the corporate organizations, they exist, but how we kind of came into this, when Jennifer and I met, we met at York University in the early 90s, dating ourselves. But we met in the early 90s, and this was a place where I was carded. I was carded because young black men, we got, you can speak to this, Paul. Young black men, at the time, do you go here? Can I see some identification? Can I see your student card? What's your student number? All this was done. And again, this is 1990, 1991, 1992. And so we occupied the president's office. And so this is a big foo-for-all. We got big, it was all big, some people got suspended, whatever. But we occupied the student office. It was ad hoc. It just came up from there. And so it was people of conscience who said this was wrong. It wasn't just black people doing it. It wasn't just black men doing it. It was the entire student body who felt, not the entire student body, but it was the people who wanted to say that this was actually wrong. And so actual change took place. Student security guards were reprimanded. People did lose their jobs over this, because we said, we're going to occupy the president's office. And we just had to take that step and put our necks on the line. And so now we've got, again, fast forward to now, and we've got, again, corporate organizations like JCA, Jamaican Canadian Association, organizations like that, who are run and staffed and volunteer organizations. And again, you talk about somebody didn't get back to you. Again, a lot of these things, these are the people who are coming and they're doing this on the weekends or over the phone and so on and so forth. So these are ad hoc organizations at best. And now they're kind of run by a lot of retirees, people who are in their very, very experienced and fighters. And imagine the amount, if they had the access that we have, this generation now, where they would have been. Can we just imagine that with all the stuff that they had to fight against? So I'm saying that now they're in a situation where I go in the room and I'm the youngest person there.
Right.
You know, and so they're now in need of fresh blood. They're now in need of new direction. But what I'm saying is that there's the polite organization, but sometimes we just got to take a stand. You know, and I think that starts as parents to say that, okay, you know, when you talk to your children, you have to be in the schoolyard and say that is wrong, and say I'm gonna tell the teacher, you know, or I'm going to tell that kid first. I'm going to tell the teacher, this is wrong, and it starts at home.
Some of it is creating our organizations. Some of it is doing things in an ad hoc way. Some of it is actually harnessing the power and the energy of institutions that are established, that we contribute to every single day. Yeah. And Alyssa, you mentioned that New College being a great environment within which to do your work. Can you talk about doing that? Why is it a great environment to, you know, propagate the kind of work that you're doing, and has there been an effort, basically, that you can talk about through advocacy that's brought about that environment?
I think New College actually stands out at the University of Toronto. I mean, if you look at any U of T promo materials, this is going online, right? If you look at any university promo materials, they'll talk about how it's a top university in the most multicultural city in the world, how about 60% of the student population is of diverse backgrounds. But I think New College is the only college at the University of Toronto that really tries to meaningfully live up to that ideal.
And how did that come about?
I think it came about through a combination of visionary leadership and faculty and student sort of advocacy. I mean, it's home to programs like African Studies, Caribbean Studies, Equity Studies, Women and Gender Studies. We can get into questions of funding and the fact that these programs have symbolic value that's very important for the University of Toronto, but they have to be run on shoestring budgets. We can come back to that just now. I know we will all have a lot to say about that. But I think that what that has done is to provide a sort of a space for us to make a home for students. You know, one of the things that we've discovered for Caribbean and African Studies students, for example, is that a lot of their academic profiles suffer. And then we get this stereotype, well, you know, black people just not as bright. I come from the Caribbean. There are black people who, like Prime Minister, all the way down to the person who is cleaning your house, who has just as much dignity. So this idea that somehow the academic profile of the black community in Canada somehow represents who we are is absolutely wrong. And one of the interesting things that we've been recently discovering among students, our students who come into Caribbean and African Studies, who are architecture students or environment students, who discover the program, is that they've started saying to us that their grades started going up when they came into the program. Not just in Caribbean or African Studies, but across the board. Because they began to see themselves finally in the curriculum in ways that allowed them then to go back, whether it was architecture, political science, economics, you name it. You know, and that's what we have to deal with. And so this is one of the things, you know, we talk about Black History Month, but Black History Month is a time to talk about the culture of whiteness in this country. And oftentimes we talk about Black History Month to talk about black people struggling, black people's agency. Those are really important. But we also need to understand the culture of whiteness. It makes it so hard for you all to find funding. That makes it so hard for you to find an educator. That makes it so hard for parents who have to work 12-hour shifts at factories. That, you know, what does it mean for them to organize in that context? And so I think for me that's what's important. And the one last thing I want to say about SUDS, the example you gave, which is really, really crucial. In my classes, for example, I always tell my students in Caribbean Studies, you know, I teach them about the Sir George Williams affair. Why did you not know? Senator Ann Cools, don't know whether she wants us to say this now, but she was part of the Sir George Williams affair when black students, because of racism from a biology professor, occupied a computer building in the most expensive student riot ever. There's a book written about it, Let the Niggers Burn, because that's what people were saying on the streets of Montreal when the police went in. Many of these were deported One became the Prime Minister of Dominica. This student protest led to the Black Power Rebellion. Well, didn't lead to it. It helped to lead to the Black Power Rebellion on the streets of Trinidad. I say it to my students not because that history can be transplanted to today, but to remind them that there were students just like them who took a stand and made something happen.
Yes.
And therefore, they have a responsibility to pay it forward. I love what you said about these organizations being run by people who are, need support, right? And so for a younger generation, because I now just realized that I could be parent to the students, this was very traumatic coming into my classes. But a younger generation, we have to pay it forward, and I think that's what's so crucial.
But I think that what's interesting and that's coming up in this conversation is that as we reflect about, our presence here in Ontario, I think about organizations like, the UNIA, the Black Action Defense Committee, that really was a shoestring organization. Mm-hmm. No funding of any kind, people out in the streets protesting, and that leading to the kind of pressure that then, creates institutions that then impact on everyone in the society. That kind of political protest that leads to, the establishment of a commission to investigate police abuse and wrongdoing, that leading to the Special Investigations Unit today, which is like one of the only organizations of its kind in North America and the world, I believe, where it was people using just their voices, organizing, coming together with actually no government backing, actually resistance, and then coming to a situation where they were able to bring to bear, working with allies, enough pressure to get an institution created like that and founded here. So there's something to be said about the shoestring turning into something that's more solid. And when I think about an organization like that, I think of Tropicana. Tropicana starting off as basically all volunteers. Can you speak about that, Gervon, to now being one of the most successful and established organizations in our community that has effectively worked with government and funders to really just enhance and put forward the work?
Well, maybe from a historical point of view, Mr. Brown, who started Tropicana, was actually doing his master's thesis, and part of his master's thesis, he did a needs assessment for the community and recognized that there was community social services need in the community, and he started off trying to meet that need in his basement. So this is just over 30 years ago. He starts off in his basement, shoestring, no funding, amongst friends, to today where you have an organization that helps over somewhere around 25,000 individuals. In terms of scope of our organization, is just under $11 million in terms of budget. It becomes a training ground for all kinds of individuals, and I think that's part of something that we sometimes miss, that these organizations, these groups that people work in, whether they're university associations or organizations or volunteer work or protest work, that often you get this incredible spill-off effect of individuals beginning to get that human capital that they take in all kinds of other walks and do all kinds of other things. Currently, Tropicana is in the midst of putting up a building that has had funding from all three levels of government, along with community funding. What do you attribute that
success to? How did it go from, what are some of the key elements, do you think, that has allowed it to move from the shoestring to $11 million?
Yeah, I think two parts. One is, and just listening to the dialogue here, I think it's really important to understand where we are, almost the existing situation. That's always important, and we can always describe where we are and how we got there. But I also think it's also very, very important to have a vision of the community and ask yourself 10 years from now, because all of us, our kids will be here 10 years from now, 20 years from now, where are we going to be in that time frame, and what are some of the things that we need to do in terms of institution building, capacity building to get there. The other part on it is, at least for me, when I was president of Tropicana, I took a trip out to Halifax and tried to find the communities, the Black black community, Afriville, and that historical context and the plaque. And we couldn't find the plaque, so we went searching for the community and driving all over for it. And I recognized very clearly that unless we put institutions and structures in place, 20 years, 30 years later, 50 years later, there's no representation of the contributions that you've made to the society. I worked in Harrow, Ontario, just in southern Ontario, where there were a lot of history of black communities going back to the 1800s, 1700s in that community. If history passes, 100 years from now, a lot of people might not even recognize that those communities made significant contribution to the growth of Ontario. So part of that in terms of institution building within the community is actually not only saying what's the vision, but making sure that we speak to the legacy of the work of all the people that's gone before. Mm-hmm. So at Tropicana, for example, we have the pictures of every single president up on the boardroom wall. And what that says to each of us as president is that we're not there for longevity, but rather we were there as custodials of this legacy of the people who came before us and made those contributions. And I think that sense of all of us making a contribution to a legacy of a society, a legacy of a community, becomes a driving force. And I'll just end off your question with an item back to my daughter. I was, some time ago, I was trying to do the fatherly thing and emailing her, because that's how we communicate often, texting or whatever. And I was trying to say about goal setting and striving towards these items, having a strategy for achieving your goals and so forth. And she wrote me back kind of like a two-liner. She says, "Dad, you're wrong." And and like, so that's line one, right? And line two, she says, "Dad, it's all about legacy." And it literally, it took me a while to actually grow up to figure it out, but it really is about that. And I think our institutions in the community, the more we can understand that it's legacy about honoring the past, but also making sure that we create a future legacy for the contributions that we can make to the society. So that would be, and I think Mr. Brown really understood that idea. I spent in his last few years having lunch with him and talking to him a lot about what he was trying to do. And there was a person that spent just endlessly working at trying to contribute to the community. But I would say that there are many, many individuals, some of them go uncelebrated in the community, that work so hard at making a contribution to the community. And on that, I do personalize it to ask the question, it's not simply what they are doing, but how do each of us make a contribution to the community and to the betterment of the society? And I think if we can figure out how we're moving that one brick, then that's our contribution. It may not be the wall, it may be that one brick, but if we ask ourselves how are we making that one contribution to the legacy, and that's how you build great institutions, great individuals, maybe that simple.
We've touched on quite a lot of points, and we're getting close to the end of the program. And before we get to the end, we do want to give a chance to people in the audience to come forward with possible questions or comments that you have to make. I think there was a mic that was going to be somewhere in the audience to encourage or allow people to be able to do that. So as I know the panel has a lot more things to say, but while we're
put up your hand,
moving to our next point, if there are people in the audience who want to jump in on the conversation now and address your question to any one of the panel members or offer your thoughts, this is the time.
Sorry, I have a mix of a question and a comment. The one thing I was thinking is the question of, you get progress, but it seems like there's less progress when you've got the progress. Let's say, for example, people will say, "Oh, you've got an Obama now, therefore let's talk about racelessness in the society." And my own experience, I'm a graduate of U of T, history department.
Oh wow, you're rare.
Yeah, and my personal experience there, and I want to just talk a bit about it, was when I came in, it's a sense of this is a liberal environment, everybody is open, and that's why I'm here, right? But and behind us is this question: what do you do to advocate in a situation where the environment is liberal, open, supposedly, but there are unsaid racisms going on, unstated racisms, or forms of lack of progress that happen. So what I want to say is, like, you know, it's in the gaze, it's in the greeting, it's in the again, the understatements, etc., that these things happen. What I'm saying is there are cases where it's naked racism, where, you know,
Yes.
I'm a South African and I know what naked racism is, but it's the unstated racism that concerns me. And how does one advocate against that?
Thank you very much for your question. I think, you know, we all have to contend with the myth of Canada, the place that people escape slavery to, and et cetera, multiculturalism and so on. But I think one of the things that we do to address that is we start to peel away that mythology, and we start to point to what's behind something like Bill C-43. And we start to make manifest the areas where there is, in fact, that naked racism or discrimination that's happening. We just can't see it. So if any one of the panel members would like to address that.
As Gervin was speaking, I was thinking about that is one of the challenges that you want to speak up sometimes, or you want to be an advocate, but you're afraid of the backlash or the consequence, or losing your position, or, you know, being demoted or relegated to the back office, depending on, you know, what your department is. So it is always a challenge. And I know for myself, I always try to choose my words very carefully and really think about what I want to say, so that I might be able to highlight the issue or the injustice that has happened without letting it go. So I think sometimes what happens is we respond immediately, and then they paint you as the angry black woman. So I think it's actually really important to think about what you want to say and how is the best way to approach it, so that, you know, you give a little bit of opportunity for the person who you're trying to educate, and a chance to not feel that they have to immediately go on the defensive. And I think, unfortunately, that's something that we always have to do. We've felt the injustice or the slight, but then we have to make them feel better about it, but then also point out that it was a problem, which is fine, as long as I can still use that as an opportunity to say, you know, the way that you're speaking about that group of people or those students or this student makes me uncomfortable. I think it's inappropriate because you're perpetuating stereotype X, Y, or Z. And I know that you have good intentions. However, I think it's problematic. So I try to choose my words very carefully, still get my point across, I say. And I think as advocates, when you're facing that, whether it's in your workplace or at your children's school or at home or in some sort of organization, you've got to figure out a way that you're going to actually get someone to hear you without yelling. Because as soon as we, you know, get angry or passionate, then they just can say you're the angry black person, and then they shut down, and they're not listening to your message, which could be a very valuable message, which they may be open to. So that's just one strategy that I've used in my personal experience. And it doesn't always work, but that's something that I've tried.
Two other panel members want to address this issue, and I would ask if the panel members could just keep your comments short so that we can turn it back to the audience if there are other audience members who want to.
We've got a story, I'm sure.
Okay. I'll add mine as 2 points. One is, if I care about curriculum and feel it's not an inclusive curriculum, then I ask myself, how can I actually be the person making that decision? So I become the Associate Dean of Academics at York, and I talk about inclusive curriculum. If I don't see individuals from broad set of communities there, I ask myself, how can I actually make that decision? So I am the Dean of the Chang School, and in that we have a unit that I advocate for, span the gaps that go out and actually bring people into the university that otherwise would not be there. If I feel we don't have the institutions, then I say, can I volunteer to actually build the institution, i.e., it may be for higher marks. I asked that question. I said, what do you need? And at the time I had a PhD, their answer was a janitor. So I volunteered as a janitor. My comment is that we can't change everything, but we do have some agency. And we have to use that part of the agency. And the part for which you don't have agency, then yes, advocacy is appropriate. But I don't think that you want to lose agency as well in the
I see
process.
Alyssa wanting to say.
Yeah, I'll just say a really quick thing, because I mean, what you said is, that really is, you've really captured Canadian racism, right? It's a really polite, I mean, you can't actually name it. And when you try to name it, it moves, right? It's this moving target, and then people get all embarrassed. And I've really learned something from you, because I am really in your face, and so it's really impossible for me to do it, because people go on the defensive. But one strategy I'll offer is also, you have to be like an answer. So, you know, we formed a group a number of years ago called the Black Faculty Group, and it ended up, it hasn't been active for a couple of years, but we started doing things like training decanal reps on hiring committees. And so what we would say is, okay, you know, this is great. So you use people's language of fairness and liberalism, and you use it in ways that they therefore have to own it. So you say, okay, great, university is really diverse, it's really inclusive. But look at how few faculty of color we have. No, very rarely do we have Aboriginal faculty. Does that mean that Aboriginal people and people of color are stupid? And everyone's like, no. Okay, then we need to find out why they're not getting here. Is it the way the job ad gets written? Is it where the job ads get placed? Is it something that happens in the composition of the long list? Is it something that happens when the long list goes to short list? Is it something that happens when they come for the interview? Is it something that happens that even if they get the job, something about the experience doesn't make them want to stay here? So we do it like that. We say, you know, we actually don't know. And you're university people, you like to have data, so let's actually track the entire process and find out why it is we're losing people. Because if you don't want to track, then you're saying that people of color are stupid, and no, you're not going to say that. Or you use the university's plan. I'm just using U of T, but it could be any university, where you read their plans and you say where they say we are committed to critical literacy. You say, great. And you put that in your document, and you go as public and as big as you want, and you make your claim. So I'm just saying there are all kinds of strategies, but that's one that I've also found quite important in terms of calling the liberalism for what it is, right? And forcing it out in the open.
I just want to add one thing just before we move on. I think, you know, all of you guys, it's really interesting because in some ways I feel like you're part of institutions. And so with those institutions, there are basic rules. So on the books, there's a basic rule of, you know, we're aspiring for equality or fairness or so you can pinpoint it, you can point it to some of these things and say, okay, well, there's only one black staff member, so we can actually we could try to hire more. In the private sector, in terms of working as a producer, an independent producer, or working in film and television, there's none of this. Okay, there's no place you can go to. There's no one you could say, hey, gee, how come, you know, of the 20 productions that were made last year, there wasn't a single producer of color involved? Nobody cares. So it's interesting to me because our struggle is really, really deep-seated. I want to give you an example. So when we were trying to get this movie made, we went to Telefilm, which is one of our agencies, and they were really supportive in many, many ways in terms of the development and so forth of the project. But as we move forwards, because when you go to development, then there's production, and production involves X amount of money, X amount of dollars. And I remember saying to them at a meeting, you know, we presented sort of like this possible cast. We had gone out and we had found someone who was going to invest money into the film, because internationally, by the way, you cannot get a European pre-sale on a black film. You can't, simply because they just don't do it. They're not interested. So we had found an investor, a guy named Don Carmody, who's literally the biggest Canadian producer right now, made over 100 films, and he put in quite a substantial amount of money. We had gotten CCH Pounder, who was a fantastic actor in all kinds of things, from Avatar on down. We had actually been talking to Sofia Conadeo, who is a BAFTA award-winning, Oscar-nominated actress, and Suds, who was an award-winning director. His first feature film won the Best First Feature at TIFF, the 11 Festival Awards, television awards, all this kind of stuff. And so we presented this package to them, and they said to us, you know, well, actually, that package, we don't believe that no one will basically go to your film, and so we can't give you that funding. So so when you talk about sort of being able to create this work, generate this work, it is, you know, you have to, the allies you have to find, you have to
find the allies.
In the most unconventional places. There's no one you can go to. It really comes out of what you can actually pull out of your hat. And that is why, essentially, there's so little in terms of content that's actually out there that, you know, just tell some of our stories. Because when you're talking about the Montreal situation, we actually went to university with a gentleman who was involved in that. That story hasn't been told.
There's another person.
There's
another person who wants to ask our last question.
One last question here.
So my question is going to be a question and a comment. I'm happy to see so many people here in the academic field because I am one half of an interracial couple. In fact, if you were ever to come to dinner at my house, you would wonder who I am in this picture because it's just I'm surrounded with everybody with blonde hair and blue eyes, but they're great people. A couple of nights ago, we were having a discussion, and one of my nephews was talking about his day at school, and he was talking about one of his classmates. And this classmate has been a source of discussion from when school started. The classmate has always been described as, oh, he's bad, he's in trouble, he causes trouble. And it finally came out that this classmate is black. My sister-in-law then went on to explain that she thinks this young black student is from a broken home and he's probably not having a lot of attention, dad is probably missing. Long story short, there was a birthday party and the child was invited and parent was there. Mom turns out to be born in Italy, speaks 3 languages and holds a position in some big corporate office. But I say all this to bring the fact that there are parents in that school who thought the best solution to dealing with this little boy was to go to the principal and have him transferred to another school. Now, I live in Midtown Toronto.
What are you talking about this year? This is occurring
yes,
this year?
this is happening.
Okay, so just in the interest of time, if we could, was your question directed to Belinda?
My question is directed to Belinda and also to Alyssa and
okay, because
Mr. Raymond. So I'll shorten it. My question is essentially, as I'm sitting there and listening to this conversation, I want to speak up. I want to say something, but how do I advocate for this little boy? Someone made mention of making schools less hostile, making teachers more, giving diversity training. How do I have a discussion with my immediate in-laws, but also on a bigger picture with friends and family who feel that if there is a child who's bad, the best policy is to have this child transferred to another school so as not to impact others? How do I advocate for that child?
Well, I mean, I think I would approach it about speaking about exclusion and inclusion. So, I mean, just and reflecting it back to any parent. How would you feel if your child was the one who was perhaps having a bad day or making bad choices as opposed to being a bad person? So I try to remove the language of labeling someone as bad and talking about maybe they're making some bad decisions. And that certainly we don't live in a society where the solution to any problem is to exclude somebody from the group or from the environment. So, I mean, I think anybody can say that and, you know, start the dialogue. I think we have to be willing to take a bit more risks about ruffling even our friends' feathers when something that they're saying or doing makes us uncomfortable. And I think that's where it starts, because maybe they haven't thought of it from their perspective. If it was their own child, would they be speaking about that person in the same way? Is that a respectful way to speak about your son's or daughter's classmates and perhaps someone else's nieces or nephew? So we have to be willing to take some of those risks about reflecting and reframing the conversation around why are we so quick to want to exclude someone? Is it really because they're bad, or is it because they're black and you don't want your child in that classroom with other kids? And there is no policy that would allow parents to go into the principal's office and say this child needs to be transferred. You can't do that. It's illegal, but they wouldn't have, no other parent can has a right to make a decision about what's happening with your child, son or daughter. And so if people are trying to do that, then we've got bigger issues if that's being allowed to happen. And I would say, just from a parent's perspective, that the people with power in the school and the system are not necessarily always the principal. The trustee, the superintendent, those are the people that are at the bigger table making bigger decisions. So if you're having issues with a school, or you feel that it's not being addressed by your vice principal or teacher or whoever, call the trustee. They're the ones that are putting us in those positions in the first place. Call the superintendent, send them an email. All of that information is public. It's on board websites. Whatever school board you're in the province, you have access to those individuals. And that's another step for you to say, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with what's happening in school X or Y, and I'd like somebody to address my concerns, and they're not being addressed at the school level. I've tried that route. So those are just some suggestions that I would make around dealing with that issue. I can't speak to your particular situation, but that's what I would try.
Thank you very much, Belinda. And I want to thank all of the panel members for joining us here today and engaging in this really exciting conversation that needs more time, but that we don't have more time to continue. And we've learned a lot today. We've learned that sometimes you have to choose your words very carefully, but tell them to somebody right in their face. And sometimes you have to occupy the space, and sometimes we have to just decide that we're going to create it. And one thing that we definitely need to do is continue these dialogues and continue to network and build and create together. So I want to thank all of you, and I want to again thank Andrew and Arlene for hosting us and the Law Society, and hopefully I'll be able to meet some of you individually in the reception afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you.